Stanford University.
The Human Experience. Inside the Humanities at Stanford University. humanexperience.stanford.edu.
I'm going to just open the discussion and then introduce our speakers, who will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for a larger discussion. I'm just going to make one point in my very brief opening remarks, and it's about art and it's about race, and I'm going to show you a couple of slides. First one is a slide of a building that no longer exists. It's at Kearny Street. But it's been rebuilt beautifully and purposefully. The point I want to make in my opening remarks is this, that race does not exist in isolation. Along with many other things, race is an integral part of life that can be abstracted conceptually and intellectually, but art places it back into the stream of real life and shows this interconnectedness. The I Hotel, which is this building, was a residential hotel on Kearny Street, filled with mostly Filipino men, elderly, who had come to work as merchant marines, agricultural workers. They were caught in a wrinkle of United States history, unable to marry white women in an age of Asian exclusion, unable to return home because of the upheavals there. And now the expansion of the financial district in the 1960s deemed them undesirables. This is an actual quote from our famous Justin Herman. This land is too valuable to permit poor people to park on it. This was the last that was remained. I should mention that it took 10 years for the eviction to be carried out because of tremendous protests citywide and actually all across the United States. So this is the last that was remained, bricks, after a 10-year fight. A great work of history came out of it, but it's also a work of autobiography written by one of the original activists of the struggle. This is by Estella Habal, San Francisco's International Hotel. I highly recommend it. It should be read in tandem with another great work, this one of fiction. It just came out, 600 pages by Karen Tayeb-Ashta. And as you can see from its plan, you can't see because the print's probably pretty fuzzy, but she's broken the book down into 10 different chapters, 10 years. Each year captures history, race, world events, local events. You see moves between Moscow, Oakland, Tule Lake, involving all sorts of players that are interlaced. So it really does illustrate beautifully my notion that race is really integral to a whole set of networks that joins people together. I'm going to end my short remarks by bringing it up to the next generation. This is Jerome Reyes, whose one-man show at the I Hotel on Kearny Street just opened. He did some interesting things with those bricks that you saw earlier. He mounted the bricks, he took the bricks intact out of respect for their history, and he wanted to do something interesting with them. He decided to do some installations, but he also decided to do something with tons of dust that emerged from the bricks as they were taken from the demolition across history after 10 years, and he sculpted things out of them. And this is actually an amazing fedora that he sculpted out of the dust of the bricks. And yeah, and look at the feather. This was a hat that was very commonly worn at the hotel. And he created, when you go over there, which I hope you do, 2,005 feathers, because the hotel was rebuilt in 2005. And his vision of the hotel was precisely to understand the history of it, but also to reanimate it, recombine it into something that was going to be living, both as a monument to the past, but looking forward to the future. So that's basically what I want to say about race, how it looks to the past, builds on history, but can look at the future through the optics of art. Now it's my privilege to introduce our speakers. Michele Elam is Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor in the Department of English. The last 3 years, she served as Director of African and African American Studies, where she developed the Race Forward Initiative, a collaboration with Stanford's Clayman Institute for Gender Studies the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, the Woods Institute for the Environment, the School of Medicine, and Religious Studies in order to incorporate race scholarship across the university. And again, I think that's a beautiful illustration about how race really does touch all sorts of different parts of our lives. Her first book, Race, Work, and Desire in American Literature, 1860 to 1930, published with Cambridge University Press, examines cross-racial working relations. Her latest book, due in print this December from Stanford, is The Souls of Mixed Folks, Race, Politics, and Aesthetics in the New Millennium. Next speaker will be Saikat Majumdar, who is an assistant professor of English at Stanford. He is the author of a forthcoming book on English as a global literary language from Columbia University Press. He's also an author of a novel, Silverfish. It's published by HarperCollins. His interests include modern and contemporary literature, world English literatures, interdisciplinary critical theory, and fiction writing. He is currently working on a transnational study of the literary public intellectual. Next is Bryan Wolf, who is the Jeanette and William Hayden Jones Professor in American Art and Culture. He currently serves as co-director of the Stanford Arts Initiative, and I lost my second page. So I will let Bryan fill out the rest of that, but he has a long and distinguished introduction. Let me pass it over to Michele.
I'm really interested in particular on how literature and arts engage contemporary social and political issues, especially this perennial and really hotly charged issue about race, even in the so-called post-race era. And I'm interested particularly in literature and the arts and how it doesn't just reflect, but also can actually influence and change our ideas about it as well. So my most recent research has been focused on this issue on the politics of and representations of mixed race and the rise of the multiracial movement in particular. And I'd like to look at specifically how, let me actually get on my scheme. Especially lowbrow or middlebrow, how graphic narratives in comics particularly engage, offer commentary on these controversial topics. And I'd like to glance, because I think sometimes comics, we overlook them, and these particular comics that I'm going to look at are nationally syndicated, Aaron Magruder and Nate Creekmore, and I'll try and read to you some of these that might be fuzzy as well. Some of them offer, I would suggest, more insight than perhaps some academics and certainly political pundits as well. So that's my premise. And I wanted to say a few things just about the controversy surrounding the multiracial movement, just a particular few, because it's really many movements. So it's often a loose coalition. It's in its sort of second generation now between interracial couples, children, offspring, biracial groups, racially adopted children, and others. And they gained, if you remember, a lot more political visibility and leverage with the 2002 Mark One or More option. 2000, I'm sorry, with the census as well. And then, of course, that was the historically first time you could mark one or more. So folks on the political left and the right have been really deeply invested in the movement from its initiation. So on the right, you would have people from the beginning, Ward Connerly and Newt Gingrich, who represented themselves as allies of the movement because they felt that breaking apart racial categories through this Mark One or More would disable race-based policies. And then on the left, you have groups, everyone from the Civil Rights Project, which was at Harvard at the time in 2000, and then has moved to UCLA, and the NAACP documented with alarm just that tendency to disable civil rights and social justice initiatives since 2000, and they protested the way, to them, it seemed like a lot of the leaders of the multiracial movements, and they keep changing in and out, but were consistently failed, in their opinion, to ally with social justice and civil rights groups, and saw themselves instead as a special interest group. And the cultural backdrop for all this political drama was, of course, what one of my colleagues calls mulatto glam, this fetting and fascination with mixed-race people as this hip new A-list generation, the sign of modernity, the proof that race was over, and that America is this true melting pot. So you just have to think of, this is the older group of people, but everyone from Vin Diesel, Halle Berry, Mariah Carey, Leona Lewis, Alicia Keys, Tiger Woods, and looking at particularly black mixes, but there's many, many more. And the New York Times Style magazine had in the last few years 2 full-page, front-page feature stories on what they call GA, Generation Ambiguous, and they argue in it how the beautiful people are prettier, healthier, and better at cross-cultural bridging, and they're hailed actually as the answer in flesh to the race problem, with the suggestion that political change can actually just occur through interracial sex. And it's so much easier and more pleasurable than sit-ins and, political drama. So, of course, it's a very seductive model. So for many, this is what Danzig Senna calls this mulatto millennium, in which mulattoes are in style, as she puts it, and black people are just so yesterday, they're so dull, the civil rights era. So that's the background for what I'm sort of looking at. Unfortunately, of course, every health, wealth, and incarceration statistic suggests that racial and social inequalities haven't abated in the multiracial world, and that tensions have only intensified between mixed race movements and the so-called monoracial groups, which sounds like a terrible appellation anyway. But of course, this issue does span, we're on the Pacific Rim, all ethnic groups as well. And I'm focusing particularly on mixed black debates, in part because they've been really especially fierce, but not that they are the only ones happening. And there's many issues on which they disagree, and I just wanted to flag a couple today, since the comic strips that I'm looking at explicitly raise these issues as well. So, and I just wanted to flag them in anticipation of the 5 slides that I'm going to show you. One is, these are some of the debates. On the one hand, you have mixed race advocates, in particular, who argue that black people are taking away their right to choose race, and that's fueled, of course, by a really dearly held American ideal of free will. In contrast, black people often feel mixed race people are trying to opt out of the race, take advantage of their often light-skinned privilege, and forget people like Angela Davis or Diane Nash or Walter White or all these other long history of civil rights leaders, some of whom weren't only light-skinned, they were blonde and blue-eyed. So secondly, you also have mixed race advocates who often suggest that everyone is so mixed it doesn't matter anymore, and you hear that a lot. Black people, on the other hand, will insist race matters as much or more, for good or for bad, both as a way of dividing, but also a way of bringing people together and a social insight, as Professor Palumbo-Liu was suggesting too. And they argue that mixed race people, as people of color, should also take race seriously in these ways. The third thing that the comics flag a lot is the idea that even though mixed race people are now celebrated as special rather than sterile cultural degenerates as they used to be in the 19th century, they sometimes still characterize themselves as tragic. And mixed race advocates say they're creating a space for themselves. Black people say they're becoming too self-indulgent. And lastly, mixed race advocates are often very interested in creating communities of like-minded or like-looking people, and you see that if you just hit the blogosphere or the community organizing, there's a lot of impulse to do that. But the risk is that sometimes they're subject to racial gatekeeping themselves, that they become exclusive communities themselves. Who's mixed enough to, all right, if you're just black and white, that's so boring. If you can list, 15, maybe you can get in. If you look a certain way, get in. So they end up, that's the argument, but as a response to the often creating gatekeeping, but they themselves are subject to it as well, because anybody who's mixed race has had the charge that they're not black enough or not Asian enough or something like that. So I want to begin with Aaron Magruder's The Boondocks, which most of you probably know, in which he deals with Jasmine, who's this new biracial kid on the block. And I'm interested in it because he uses the literary arts in a way to both crystallize and dramatize these issues and prompts critical reflection, even if he doesn't legislate action. He's not actually weighing in. So the first one is, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's Jasmine alone. Can you guys see that? Kind of. She's waxing, sorry for herself, basically, and she's talking about feeling like a yellow flower and in a field of roses, and her parents say she's special, but she just feels lonely. And then, of course, over in the side, you get Huey, as in Huey Newton, he's named after. He says, "You're black, get over it." So part of, his little challenge to her, the mixed race advocates hated this. He got slammed for this. They thought that she was being very cruel to her. But of course, this is the argument that she shouldn't be so special. The second one, this is all about knowing your history in particular. The first 2 frames, you don't need to look at. It's the bottom frame that's most important. This is when they first see Jasmine and they say there's a new black person, and it says, well, she's black and white. At the bottom of it, I don't know if you can read it, I'm not sure I can actually read it. He asks, it's really good to have black people in the neighborhood. And she says, well, gee, why do you think I'm black? I don't know. And he says, well, first of all, Mariah, your afro's bigger than mine. She says, I don't have an afro. It's just a little frizzy today. This is her refrain during the whole thing. She says, Angela Davis has a little frizzy. You have an afro. I do not. And who is Angela Davis? And that comes up a lot, too, which is not knowing your history, a sort of little, prompt. Then she says, she's always trying to befriend him. She's prepubescent and she wants to be friends. And he says, so, Jasmine, if you're not black, like, what are you? She says, well, and this is the litany of genealogy that's almost de rigueur in mixed race movements. My mother is 1/4 Irish, 1/4 Swedish, and 1/2 German. And my grandmother, my father's side, is a part Cherokee. And my grandfather, who's mostly French, I think because originally he's from Louisiana and his family was from Haiti, I believe, which makes you as black as Richard Roundtree in Shaft. It does not, and who is Richard Roundtree? So she still doesn't understand that. She doesn't understand, not the pop cultural references, but also he's suggesting here too that rehearsing your genealogy and your demographics really offers no insight into how race works on the ground. And what's not in here too is later on he says, well, I'm mixed too, and I feel for you. And she says, really? What are you? He says, well, I'm part Negro, part colored, part black. To remind her that race is also a political commitment too. It isn't simply where you're from as well. The last one is the tragic part as well. At the very top, she's saying, you keep making fun of me. I'm really tired of it. I just want to be human. That bid for human, for being post-race and colorblind, you hear a lot as well. And then he says, you are tragic. It is really awful that you have to move between opposing worlds and everything. And it's so tragic that you have to listen to Kenny G and Michael Bolton at home because you're biracial. So it's not tragic that. But the point I wanted to make here, just to sum up with him as well, is that he also, even though he's challenging her and giving her a hard time and a send-up of all of the pieties that the mixed race movement really wants, she also has to learn some things too. And she ends up challenging him at these last 2 episodes where she meets a little white girl and she thinks it's so easy to be friends with her. It's not going to be a problem. And the girl points out that her father's been talking about the black family moving in and meaning her family, but she doesn't realize that she's black, and that the property values are going down, and she'll meet real black people, and she says, but I don't know what any of that means. And then Jasmine at the end says, lucky you. So she really, even though there's this poking fun at her between 2 worlds, the comic strip makes it clear that she actually is. The last episode that I wanted to show you here is that he also critiques the liberal pretensions of the interracial families that feel potentially sometimes smug about being post-race here too. You have the white mother, she brings out her NAACP credentials. I don't know if you can see this or two, but he's obsessed with hair, and she knows she realizes it's a black thing to deal with the hair. Her father suggests that Jasmine's hair needs to be straightened, and at the very end he proposes some therapeutics of Afrocentric wellness that will help her as well. And we don't have time for Nate Creekmore too, but he also is a syndicated columnist who critiques the idea of what he wants to call the African American movement. This one gets sidelined in part by adolescent angst, but he's also very interested in what brings people together, what pulls them apart. And that's mostly what I wanted to share with you, simply because I think Litquake is such a great place to think about literature as this vibrant and dynamic site for social questioning and social change and social critique that I think sometimes gets flattened in the newscast or in Norton anthologies that we look at as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. That was fun. It's great to be, always great to be at Litquake, and this time to talk about something which is very close to my heart. I think in academia, when it comes to race and ethnicity, the social sciences get a kind of press and visibility which certainly not granted to the natural sciences, and to the humanities, well, it's complicated. So today I wanted to think a little bit about what are the ways in which literature and other aesthetic medium can deal with questions of race and ethnicity in ways that is probably not possible in the social sciences, not to make too artificial a distinction, but what are the unique ways one can do it. And there are, of course, a million ways of entering this discussion, but one could do a lot worse than open with the question of language. And whenever I think of language as a kind of a venue for racial struggle or conflict, I'm reminded of a very famous debate, probably now closed, that took place in Africa between the 1970s and 80s. And the issue was whether English can be a kind of a literary language for decolonized Africa. It's also an issue which is personally very important to me. I think a lot about the potentials and the pitfalls of English as a language of world literature, not just a world language, but a world literary language. Many of you probably know the debate by now. The two heavyweights fighting on either sides of this debate are Chinua Achebe and Ngugi Wa Thiong'o. And Achebe was in favor of English, and Achebe's argument was English can be Africanized. English can become a local language. It can become a vernacular, and you can do this by using African proverbs, African idioms, even using English in a way so that it kind of reflects the syntax and the kind of lilt of local vernaculars. And he has some amazing examples. Those of you who've read his fiction know that he actually does practice what he preaches in this manifesto. Ngugi, on the other hand, was very skeptical about this. He felt that language is inseparable from race and culture. And English in Africa will always bear the burden of this kind of European imperial domination. It's never possible, so you can't really do it. So this debate is, it's been more than 30 years, it's pretty much over, and I think it's fair to say that while Ngugi makes a lot of powerful points, for all intents and purposes, Achebe seems to have won the debate, with all the wonderful African English literature coming out of it. It's, Ngugi himself exemplified it, though he had a complex relationship with vernacular. He went back to writing in vernacular. But so that is a debate which I don't wish to enter here. I'm just using the debate to kind of a point of entry into a number of issues about the relationship between language and race. I think the key question here is to kind of simplify to what extent race is a material entity and to what extent it's a cultural phenomenon. And it's again a kind of somewhat artificially distinguished category. But what I'm doing here is basically following Marx's famous distinction between base and superstructure. That the economic base of society, which includes the market and probably kind of physical forces like guns and violence on one hand, and which is the base. He uses the model of a house where it's kind of the concrete base. And the rest is all superstructure. So the rest is, art, literature, religion, philosophy. Everything is superstructure. And according to Marx, as you probably all know, is that the base decides the superstructure. Superstructure, what it looks like, depends on the base. So the question is, and Ngugi actually has a beautiful sentence in his manifesto, which kind of reflects this Marxist belief. And he writes, "Culture is a product and reflection of human beings communicating with one another in the very struggle to create wealth and control it." So creation of wealth is the primary process, and culture is created as a kind of a byproduct. But it's not just kind of utilitarian communication. It's not just, okay, pass me the hunting spear and that kind of thing. It's also aesthetic communication. It's also communication for the sake of it. It's also emotional communication. So the question is, what happens when one race dominates another one? And this is where it gets interesting, because the base might dominate, control the superstructure, but to kind of continue this domination, one needs superstructural control as well. That is again Ngugi borrowing another beautiful image from him, is that but the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the blackboard. So this is, we have the classic binary between hard and soft power. When one race dominates the other, which is kind of the global racial domination, is imperialism and colonialism. Cultural imperialism must follow physical imperialism. And the reverse is also true. So when it comes to liberation or attempts at liberation, culture, it needs both material and cultural action. And this is why the question of English as a kind of decolonized language had become so contended, such an intense issue, because it becomes the prime site of this kind of struggle. That being said, I think the temporal relation between hard and soft power, which Ngugi points out, is probably a little more simplistic. It's not that the knight of the bullet always has to come first. Often in instances, the chalkboard kind of precedes the bullet. The order is hard to say, but they have a very interesting and intriguing relationship. And this is why I think repeatedly, historically, during physical warfare, literature becomes a venue. We've seen the Cold War, we've seen, it becomes kind of a venue where things are fought. And this is exactly the battle that is being fought between races in the question of whether English can be a language of spaces which were dominated by white races. So I just want to kind of conclude by examining why this is the case. Why is literature a particularly effective venue for cultural action? And again, why kind of action which material force can never really do without? It's actually indispensable. It's not complete. And in what way it's actually different from other disciplines like sociology, political science, economics, many of which seem to have a kind of a connection to racial questions with an urgency which we don't see in the aesthetic medium. And my sense is, as we've seen it in both David's and Michele's presentation, is that literature or the arts, they reside as this unique intersection of the personal and the collective, at this kind of meeting point. We know now that it's not mainly personal, it's kind of refracted by collective forces, but unless it retains that allegiance to the personal consciousness, it kind of loses its uniqueness. And that is its unique force. I think that's where it also differs from the hardest social sciences, which are probably primarily interested in collective patterns of behavior. And it's kind of simplification, and I stand to be corrected, but I think that's one difference that's very clear, which becomes kind of very urgent in the debate between Achebe and Ngugi in their essays also. So if we think of literature as an agent of social change, either whether of racial domination or of racial liberation, which needs to go with kind of this physical material action, whether of the market or of military action, persuasion is very key. One needs to persuade, one needs to convince, and and you cannot really persuade unless you can also enter the individual private consciousness. Persuasion is not even when it happens on a collective scale, the entry into the private mind is very crucial. And literature and arts makes this appeal to the subjective consciousness. But it also connects the subjective consciousness to a kind of collectively experienced realities, like race, which is again this unique intersection of the personal, the historical, and the collective. And it does so through aesthetically crafted language, which again in turn is a wonderful example of the combination of the personal and the collective. Because language is something which is collectively possessed, and yet its use is almost personal and idiosyncratic, even in everyday use. And this, I think, is extremely crucial to the question of race and ethnicity, as they are a matter of embodied experience. We all know that we live it. It's not something which we can just theorize, which we just understand. But it's something which one lives. And aesthetics, I think, at the risk of sounding like this kind of dull crusader in the favor of the aesthetic and being harsh on the social sciences, that they really simulate this embodiment of experience. Just the way race exists in the world as a kind of a plural being, as opposed to just understand or theorize it, which it also does. But that is the unique thing it does, as we keep seeing in the presentations. So thank you very much.
What I'd like to do comes right out of what Saikat was talking about. I'd like to look at a book. This is Litquake, so I'd like to have all of us read a book together. And if this leaves you a little concerned and wondering about my Dickensian imagination here, it's actually only a 5-page book. And so you can emerge from here saying, yes, at Litquake today, I read a new book. And the author of the book, and what you see is actually sort of the book here. You can see that it's an artist's book. It's not the average sort of book. Done by a Chicana artist who lives in Texas named Celia Munoz. And the title of the book is Which Came First? Enlightenment Number 4. So we could have, let's go to page 1 and see what's up. Right, there we go. So here's page 1. And what the book is a series of 5 prints that you take from this wonderfully constructed wooden case. Page 1. In each of the pages, you will see a sort of 3-tiered dimension. At the top, there is an image of eggs set against a plain background. In the middle, there is a print line, and then below it is the efforts of a young child to practice, in this case, her cursive writing, to learn cursive text here. And if we might just pause for a moment to look at what each of those represents in the development of this book, we have exactly here the story that Saikat was talking about of the intersection of the personal and the collective. This is a story of a young child entering school for the first time. So you see at the top level a series of eggs. And if you know the history of advertising and commercial photography, you will recognize this as a very 1950s sort of advertisement image. And what it raises for us are 2 issues, just in the image itself. The first is the question of eggs, and with them the notions of birth and rebirth and regeneration. And we'll have to take that into account as we go through our novel. And the second is the larger question of conformity versus individualism. The fact that we have individually enumerated eggs, and yet they all look the same. So the collectivity and the person. And the text in print, in case you can't read that there, the line says, learning to speak English and understanding chickens were the hardest things for me during the primary grades. And then we see the cursive below of the young child just entering school and learning to write, the chicken will lay an egg today. And what we need to do by the time we get to the end of our book, by page 5, is to understand what is the relation between speaking English and understanding chickens. And what we know from the bottom line here is that the child is mastering not only the cursive script, but tenses, temporality, time itself, what novels are about. Because we begin with today, and we will be going to tomorrow and to yesterday, and to the whole range of history that Michele was talking about earlier. And that's fine, and what I want to note in this case is not only do we have the child's handwriting, but you'll notice the lines that bind the writing in those textbooks or tablets that we all learn to write with. And what that suggests, though we would pass it by without noticing, but what that suggests is the way that the body of the child, the hand of the child that makes that script, is at some almost invisible language level constrained. What the child is learning to do is to write properly, which means to keep all the letters between the assigned lines. It's an act of social discipline as much as it is an act of self-expression. So we get to page 2. And in the print we have the wonderful next phase. I would always ask, how does a chicken lie an egg? And the cursive, the chicken laid an egg yesterday. Again, what we learn from that print line here is the child's difficulties with those words that all of us have difficulty. What's the relationship between lie and lay? All right, different verbs with different usages that overlap. And the child clearly is confusing them. But the confusion is exactly what concerns us, because that confusion represents a moment of slippage. It's the moment when suddenly grammar isn't working. It's not providing its sort of socializing, acculturating function. And in that moment of dysfunction, that moment of ungrammatical mistake, what actually you do is open out to a larger truth. And that truth is in the word lie. What are the social, cultural lies that we learn in the process of an education? And to answer that question, we go to page 3. And you will note, as we visually move through the book, that our eggs are rotating from left to right. They're eventually going to go from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And in each image, we move sequentially a little bit more towards that 3 o'clock point. And the text now says, I was always corrected and told a chicken lays an egg through its mouth. And the cursive continues, the chicken will lay an egg tomorrow. So if we go back to the print, which is clearly the language of an adult, looking back retrospectively on her experience as a child, the experience recorded in the writing below, what we get here is that sense here of the power of institutions. You can hear the other kids taunting the young child, learning English, entering into the mainstream system by telling her cruelly, a chicken lays an egg through its mouth. It's a sort of act of social cruelty, one child to another, but it's also a statement here that this is where enlightenment begins, going back to the title. It begins with that effort to understand how what we hear from the culture around us has to be evaluated and ascertained in order to understand our position, who we are, and whether or not what we're being told corresponds to our experience of the truth. So we go to page 4. And the eggs continue their slow rotation to the right, and the line reads, I would sit attentively for hours in front of the chicken in hopes of witnessing the event. And the cursive reads, the chicken has laid an egg already. Okay? So let's look at the word witnessing here and understand it as part of that educational process to mean not the passivity of the child, I am a passive witness, but the active act of witnessing, where to witness is to begin to think critically about the world around you, actively to engage it and to observe it, to understand its meanings. And then, when we are told the chicken has laid an egg already, we have to think to that sort of idiom, that colloquialism that we have about what it means to lay an egg, which among other things also means to make a mistake, to drop a bombshell, to miscarry in our meanings. I laid an egg when I did this. And if that's the case, what this child is learning when she says the chicken has laid an egg already is that already, even in those opening days of her education, a bomb has been dropped. She's been placed in the middle of a socially radioactive zone, which we call culture, and which is what happens to an outsider trying to socialize into a mainstream that actually may betray her origins. So we get to page 5, the conclusion. Okay, this should be the aha moment on everyone's part. What just happened in that image as you looked at it? You thought you were looking at equal-sized eggs rotating to the right. You assumed Renaissance-based perspective, systems of perspective, And so you felt each egg was the same size as the rotation occurred. We now have the eggs lined up flush with the surface, and we discovered all the eggs are different, which is an obvious cultural statement that even in the very midst of socialization, difference is supreme. And it depends on your vantage point. It depends on your capacity. Part of what education does is give you the capacity to recognize and reclaim difference, even in the face of conformity. And the line of the text is, unfortunately, they were always too fast for me. And the cursive reads, the chicken lies every day. And now we have our moment of enlightenment. Our understanding here that those lies are actually not grammatical issues of lay and lie and how you properly use the right grammar. They are questions of how culture operates to socialize us into forms of cultural and ethnic and racial forgetting, and in the process to blind us to a difference that we can only see at certain moments and from certain vantages. So let me just conclude that. We now can understand our title, that the Enlightenment is not just the child's, but is ours. We too have been enlightened in that aha moment. And that language about laying an egg through the mouth has a deeper truth to it. Because what it suggests in that egg imagery is something is being born. And with the mouth imagery, that what is being born is language, is insight, is vision. And where do these things still exist in our world? They exist in books, in literacy, which is now understood simply not as learning what you are told, but learning to decode what you are told, where a deeper, truer education is coming to understand how you have been placed by culture and how you can respond to by critically thinking about that situation. And so finally, this education is to be found where? It's to be found in books. It is the power of language and literature and books, not simply to impose order, as in what happens with the lines and the script, but to deconstruct, to give us the capacity for taking apart those systems of power in order to understand our own empowered, because now enlightened, relation to those systems. So we might take Munoz's book in conclusion and say, what we've really read here in our shared engagement of those 5 amazing pages is a portrait of the artist as a young woman.
We didn't actually know what the other one was going to say. And it turned out really well, I think, in that there were a lot of things that resonated amongst all of us. One thing I would think of saying was the idea of, as Saikat and Bryan both mentioned, the intersection of the individual and the collective, but understanding collective as very complex. In other words, a collectivity can be formed in all sorts of different ways and overlap. And I think the egg perspective really drove that home, right? That we can imagine that certain collectives are cohere in a very particular way and are almost organic. And then we can switch that angle slightly and realize that they break apart in very different ways and can recombine. Also the pressure to see things in certain ways that both Michele and Bryan pointed out. The idea that certain ways of talking about things have to be adhered to, not just because they're logical, but because there are political and personal consequences. You know, how are you going to ally yourself at different moments with different things? And then the whole idea of language that Saikat brought out very well, right? That language itself is, of course, our social medium, but we come to it in very different ways. And one term that I think undergirded a lot of our comments was one that comes from literary criticism, heteroglossia. That each word is, in a sense, able to be glossed in very different ways, so that it's not uncommon experience that we will use a word with somebody that we may know very well and then find out we're talking about two very different things, even though we're using the same language. Why is that? Because we're recombining as individuals across different contexts and different moments. So race is certainly one thing, but as I tried to point out in my presentation, race never exists in and of itself. It's always embedded in life, and life can be animated both in real terms, but also as artists that we've looked at today, imagined both in utopian ways, ways that we can imagine living together differently, or maybe imagining race as being something quite different.
I want to pick up on something that you mentioned about that tension between the individual and the collective, because in mixed race debates, that gets read very differently. So the discussion is whether or not race is individual will, I can choose whatever I want, or social ascription. And usually those things are seen very much at odds. And so the idea of the collective is seen both as a positive or a negative sometimes, depending on your perspective. So sometimes the collective is racial hegemony. You're just supposed to be slotted into this one category. It's like other people telling you what you're supposed to do. You know, U.S. Americans don't like that anyway. That's often demonized as negative. But another way of thinking about it that some of the artists look at, particularly that I think is helpful, is what you're saying too, is how does your individual experience connect up with other groups, particularly in terms of social justice. And so it's not simply us versus them, it's also how do you as individuals connect up with other social networks, other issues, what's the political impact of your choices too. And one that I always give the example is when I was in Tacoma, I was in 2000, which was when that census first came out. And it's a military town, and there were a lot of interracial couples. And the mixed race advocates went around saying, you should do this, check this, mark one or more boxes. You know, this is the exercise of your rights, and it's honoring your parents and all this. And they had, it was a site for personal expression. On the other hand, you had the NAACP and the Urban League coming out and saying, don't do this. It's, you know, it's going to either dilute our numbers, or we don't know how to translate the political impact. And in fact, the city elders didn't know how to translate originally. It's been now corrected. How to translate when somebody checked black and white. And I lived near an empowerment zone, which was based on demographics, and was basically allowed us to have funding for businesses in this lower income area based on the fact that it was indexed to the people of color who were there as well. And so we had a Walgreens there, which wasn't great, but before then you had to have toilet paper across if you wanted to buy some across town. So people were glad to have it. But within 3 months of this of the census, the city elders ended up checking those who checked black and white as white and lost the empowerment zone. And they corrected for it, but I know that the people checking those boxes for the census had no clue of the political impact of what they were doing. If the city didn't even know how to do it. So sometimes things that look like they're straightforward is this palimpsest of completely confused, competing ideas, of, especially around race. So that's another way of thinking about it, that it's not just other people oppressing you, that somehow it's, the collective is also a way of thinking about race as both personal and yet in a larger social justice context.
I had a question for Bryan actually, and I really enjoyed the book, the whole book. But I noticed that it ended with this desire for mastery, that I need to understand and kind of, even the word enlightenment is useful. And to be honest, I was a little disappointed. I was hoping that should somehow just do something frustrating, or she kind of ended up being really co-opted. It's like, and yeah, and I see the message that it's about understanding, and understanding is a way of getting a control over things. That's true, but sometimes I feel like that has its limits. There are certain things which you don't deal with understanding. You just mess things up. And I think that's exactly why aesthetics is kind of unique, as opposed to. Did you feel that that instinct came through, or?
Let me a quick reply. I feel as if this what the book does basically is say, before you even move into the political realm, before you can begin to resolve economic issues, you need a clear understanding of how you have been constructed by cultural forces outside yourself. And that is the Enlightenment in that way. So it's not so much a dichotomy in which sort of the book ends simply happily, but merely at the level of mental consciousness without the possibility of engagement with the world. It's almost as if what the book is giving us are the terms, the preconditions for engagement with the world.
What is exactly the power of art? How can art work to articulate issues that we've been talking about centered around race? And again, I'm going to promote Jerome's show because I just happen to be organizing this service learning course that brings students from Stanford up to the iHotel and work. And it turned out that he was actually a visiting artist at Stanford. So he emailed me and he said, you know, can I come over and see you? I'd like to introduce myself. I said, fine. And he came over and he had his backpack and brings out the present to the professor. It's this brick. He just puts this brick on my table. And I said, oh my God. And he said, yeah. And I said, and then he proceeded to roll out the 1906 blueprints for the iHotel. And he had uploaded everything into his computer, and he had the whole iHotel virtually reconstructed. And he said, what I want to do in the exhibit is to think of not just the physical spaces, but the energy that flowed through. And it's amazing bringing in from like wave technology and thermodynamics. He had created all these different ways of depicting energy. And he said, I don't want this to be a memorial to the iHotel. I wanted to imagine what would happen if it hadn't been torn down, to look to the future. And so that's a huge component of the art, is to restore something that had been truncated, disappeared, obliviated, and to imagine it purposefully as something that could create a kind of life space and an imagination that could be something that would animate our lives today, right? In other words, we wouldn't simply sit there memorializing and paying homage, but we would take that spirit and build something new, given our contemporary situation. In other words, not to be retrograde, but to be progressive. So I think that's one of the things that I really look to art and literature as doing, is not denying the material base at all, but to, in a sense, almost in a Benjaminian way, to look at the current political base and see what we can learn from the past to inform the future. So.
I think it's actually most exciting when art and literature can contradict the power relation at the base, because it's almost predictable that it will follow. And obviously, classic Marxist analysis says that you cannot, literature will always reflect the interest of the people in power. But I think the subversive literature truly, actually can mess up the equation. And that happens rarely, but that's exactly what is interesting. Actually, I was thinking of what Michele said about the question of mixed race, and I was thinking that this whole idea of them becoming hip is kind of a troubling relationship with the question of the market, because it's about being the market. It's really certain kind of hipness which is very marketable, and I wonder what you thought of that, because it's liberating on one end, but it actually can be very reactionary on the other.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're closing up here, but I don't think it's right. It turns out that a lot of mixed race images are on corporate websites, and a colleague of mine pointed out global corporate, so it's usually turned outward, so it's representing, it was like a big military organization, I can't remember just recently, who'd actually had it, not just to show diversity, but to show that they are new millennials and that they are representing America as a sort of hip. But they're always very sanitized images. They're always, it's not like they bring any they don't bring any hair baggage. They're sort of like a light-skinned, high-yellow version of So you're absolutely right. Of course, the commodification of mixed race is one of the most disturbing things, and it's one of the things that these artists will critique. But it's very hard to do it, partly because you're right. It's not just linked to. It's very seductive. It's very powerful, and also people have private experiences with it. A lot of people will point out that mixed race people have been demonized for so long, literally a couple centuries, so that this sort of overcompensation. So that question of what's subversive or not, what's co-opted or not is I mean, with the corporations using it, I would say it's cynically, it is co-opted. But it's hard to always see where that line is. Well, there's a couple just recently, just because we just taught one. One is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, so Junot Diaz. And then also People of Paper, I know, it's so good. And People of Paper by Salvador Plasencia, were both specifically speaking about race, cultural literacy, change both my notions, I think, of race on the ground and also language and literature.
Well, this is an older book, but Lahiri's Interpreter of Maladies, which is a series of short stories, which I think is amazing.
I highly recommend the South African writer Zoe Wikom's new novel, Playing in the Light. Really dramatic kind of the whole post-apartheid situation, and has a really kind of scary twist in the tale, and also about the mixed race question. It's a beautiful, beautiful novel. She's not as well known as she should be, but highly recommended.
I will make two suggestions, one very historical. For those of you who haven't had the privilege of reading Frederick Douglass, the great 19th century escaped slave who then wrote his autobiography in the North, it's simply called The Narrative, and it is an extraordinary story of sort of the meaning of race in his historical sort of reverberations. And the other book I would mention to bring us up to the present is the Karente Yamashita. What was the name of her first novel? Yes, right. Tropic of Orange. Tropic of Orange. There we go. Sorry, I just don't remember titles well. This is a book about Los Angeles, and it turns Los Angeles into a template of what it means to live in a divided, ideologically fraught, multiracial society. And it's an extraordinary narrative.
Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.